Good evening. Keir Starmer said the words small boats and English Channel not once in his big Labour Party conference speech today, and he muttered the word illegal migration on just one occasion in a speech that lasted more than an hour. Instead, he made the tone-deaf assumption that Britain's objection to immigration is simply about skin colour.
And to those who say that the only way to love your country is to hate your neighbour because they look different, I say, not only do we reject you, we know that you will never win, because the British values we stand for, not just the rule of law, but a love for this country and our neighbours, the respect for difference under the same flag that is stronger than bricks, and you know it. It's what you cannot stand about our country, our reasonable, tolerant country, but it's absolutely who we are.
So make no mistake, the next general election will be fought on one single issue, immigration and leaving the ECHR. And Labour better understand this sharpish if they want to keep hold of power, because right now the PM is completely out of touch with Britain. Most sane-minded people do not care about skin colour. 25,000 people have crossed the Channel since in small boats this year, and I couldn't care less if there were 25,000 white Americans doing it. I do not care. Britain is full. That's the truth. It's bursting at the seams and collapsing under the weight of its exploding population. The concern isn't about skin colour, it's about our schools and hospitals and housing being overwhelmed with too many people, and the grave national security risk undocumented illegal migrants pose us. Nobody, barring a few idiots, care about skin colour. And brushing off concerns about legal and illegal migration by suggesting that is, quite frankly, all it's about, is lazy at best and worst, stupid. Yvette Cooper didn't do much better in her speech earlier in the day either. Her delivery was 1,800 words long. And guess how many times she mentioned the word immigration? 4 times. Guess how many times she uttered the word migration? 6 times. So that's 10. Our Home Secretary, responsible for protecting our borders, skirting the one issue that defines mostly every other part of British life, from housing and health to education and community. Nothing on policy, nothing on how Labour's useless border security command would stop the boats, and nothing on how Labour are going to reduce legal net migration. She did have time for this, though.
So don't anyone tell me that was protest. Don't anyone tell me that was about immigration or policing or poverty. Plenty of people have strong views on immigration, on crime, on the NHS and more, but they don't pick up bricks and throw them at the police. They don't set light to buildings with people inside. It was arson. It was racism. It was thuggery. It was crime.
The Home Secretary is once again doubling down and whitewashing concerns over migration with a few mindless idiots who chose to commit crime. It wasn't just Southport that sparked protests and then the riots. It was the clear two-tier policing of the Hares Hill riots in Leeds, and earlier, the Manchester Airport alleged assault on police officers, for which, by the way, no one has been charged for any crime with yet. And those incidents left the nation worried and angry. And Yvette Cooper, the Home Secretary, doesn't get it. Keir Starmer doesn't get it. And Labour doesn't get the country. Their massive majority is built on flimsy foundations. Their loveless election landslide clocked a lower vote share than Jeremy Corbyn. And the electorate, particularly the Red Wall, will punish them for it. Let's get the thoughts of my panel now. Columnist and broadcaster Esther Kraku, Director of the Centre for Migration and Economic Prosperity, Stephen Wolfe, and political commentator Jonathan Liss. Jonathan, I'll start with you again, if you don't mind, because you're pulling funny faces. What's your thoughts about that? They don't get migration, do they, Labour? They, frankly, don't care about it either.
Ben, I know that GB News isn't necessarily balanced, but that was probably the most unbalanced introduction I've ever heard.
In what way?
Because it was just this complete diatribe against Labour, so rooted in one perspective.
Well, it was
I know that I'm here to provide a balance, but I kind of think that you could have approached that speech in a different way. Look,
okay. What's not true? Let's go through it point by point. It's not
about things that are not true. You didn't say anything that was factually incorrect from what I recall you saying just now. But I think that the way that you frame it is not necessarily helpful to conduce to a constructive debate. Clearly, there are a lot of people in this country who who are racist. There are a lot of racists in this country. I don't think it's politically... Look, I'm not saying it's...
We haven't got any evidence there's a lot of people who are racist.
Stephen,
I mean, come on, that's huge.
No, look, there are people...
I think it's the opposite. I think it's a small number of people who are racist.
I'm glad you think that. I happen to think there are actually more people than is... And, yeah, I'm often accused of being politically correct and snowflakey, woke, whatever, but when I dare to say something that I think is the truth, people shout me down and say, no, that's not true, that's not true. Well, I'm sorry, I think it is true.
So
now, I'm not saying that... I'm not
saying
saying that everyone who is concerned about immigration is racist. I'm not saying that. But I also think it's completely legitimate for the Prime Minister to point out there are a lot of people who don't like their neighbours because of the way they look or the way they dress or the different culture they might have.
I agree.
That's legitimate for him to point out.
But the point is they're doing that and then not addressing the legitimate concerns about migration.
But they are.
Whitewashing...
Starmer literally said in his speech that he wants to bring down net migration. And obviously, net migration is an interesting term because it means that you're having to regulate the people who leave the country as well as the people who come in. But he does want to do that. Now, I actually am much less concerned about immigration than Starmer is, but he is acknowledging that migration is an issue. He's just picking up on the people who are racist, which is fine.
I think it's one of the interesting things that you mentioned was about where these voters, the voters that feel like the Labour Party are such are going to go, because they're certainly not going to go further left. The people that, as you say, are rightfully concerned about immigration levels being too high, or the fact that immigrants that are coming into this country are not socially integrating. You have communities that are living parallel lives alongside the rest of us, which is a problem, because if you don't know your neighbour, you're less likely to like them. If you feel like your neighbour hasn't bought into British values, you're thinking, what is actually going on here? Who's in control? And the reality is the actual implications of this are more severe than people think. They're not going to go further to the left, right? If Labour doesn't get this right, and the British public at the end of 5 years still thinks they're either deliberately gaslighting or deliberately ignoring people, they're just going to move further right. And that space is being occupied by Reform. Reform came second in over 100 seats, almost 100 seats at the last election. The real threat on the Tories are finished. The Tories are toast. But by saying, what did Vivek Cooper say, that they're right-wing wreckers?
Right-wing wreckers, which is
fine. That's on brand for the Labour Party. But I think actually, on a practical level, she's really ignoring a huge gap in the market that has been created by this.
Stephen, Jonathan says that Starmer cares about migration, right? But he didn't mention the word small boats or English Channel once in his speech.
No, he didn't, and in reflecting on what Yvette Cooper said as well, she didn't really either, because it's really not the sort of thing that they're going to mention at their conference, because there are lots of people in the Labour Party who are, like Jonathan, not concerned that much about large-scale migration into this country, and yet they are concerned about housing, they are concerned about the cost of water and our public services, they are concerned about...
How do you disconnect the two?
Well,
how do you disconnect high levels of migration?
Well, I was going to say, there's a cognizant dissonance that's within the Labour Party and the socialists as a whole, who cannot understand that mass migration plus population is the driver in today's Britain of all the costs that are impacting all of society.
Okay,
Stephen, look, we all know, and you know particularly, that the biggest chunk of migration in this country is people who are being let in by the government. And the reason they're being let in by the government is that they are here to fulfil gaps in our economy. The government has the right, by the way, it had the right to do this before Brexit as well, in many cases, but it certainly has the right now to turn down pretty much anyone that it doesn't want in this country. But it's not doing that, so we focus, the government, the Conservative government, focused on the irregular or illegal migration, if you want to call it that, because that was
it's always been called, Jonathan.
No, it's...
You're just doing what Starmer does and Labour are doing now, some bizarre twist where they're saying irregular migration.
Irregular is a neutral term. Illegal migration is a loaded term.
It's a term that's been introduced by the EU, but actually when you're doing statistics, there is very clear delineal lines between legal and illegal migration.
Well, whatever...
And that's where we're coming at. The point that we've got to look at is, you're right that the Conservative Party made a massive mistake with some of its ways that it opened up legal migration, particularly when you allowed families of students to come across, particularly when you allowed families of people who got visas. They are massive problems too. But the overall picture is that we've led to huge population growth, 10 million people in over 20 years connected to it. 2/3 of all births in this country are caused by people who've come here in the last few years, who are migrants. all of those have an impact on the health service.
Two-thirds? What are you saying? Two-thirds of all births to people born are born to people who weren't born. Is that what you're saying?
That's right.
No, you didn't say that. You didn't say to people.
Native.
Wait, so in the last few years, so recent immigrants or people who might have been born elsewhere and they came as children? It
doesn't really matter. The statistics.
Well, it does matter. Otherwise, the statistics useless.
Over the last 3 years, population growth has been driven 95%
my parents weren't born here. Is that a problem?
You're missing
was
the
my
point.
grandmother, but we're talking about today's figures, not about those when we didn't have the mass levels of population, when we were recovering after the Second World War, for example. What you have is the huge population growth being pushed because of migration. And then you look at housing, then you look at the cost of everything that's impacting our society. You cannot take it away. And why Starmer is wrong is because he says, I'm interested in it, I'm concerned about it, but the policies they're currently talking about are not really practical enough to deal with it. And the reason why it comes back to the vast majority of the Labour Party members are not as concerned about immigration because for some reason it doesn't impact them.
Jonathan,
that's not true. It doesn't impact them. They might just happen to agree with it.
Let me just pick you up on a point. You said that you mentioned that migration was good for the economy. They're filling holes in the economy. Well, GDP per capita has been contracting for many, many years now, all while population has been exploding. So how do you square that circle?
Well, look, Britain has a huge productivity problem, and we have massive labour shortages.
But I thought migrants, we've had uncontrolled mass migration on a scale.
Hasn't been uncontrolled. It's not uncontrolled. The government has always had control. It's literally not uncontrolled. If you've ever been to an airport in this country, you'll know there is someone, literally, even if you're British, who is checking that you have the right to come into this country. It's not an open border. It never has been. And if we hadn't had all those people coming in to work in our NHS or to work in the care sector or to go to our universities, because our universities are on the brink of failure, then it would have been even worse, I guarantee you.
No, some of them should perhaps, because we've been over-reliant on bringing people in from different countries to kind of sustain this kind of growth that was there. But when you look at the numbers coming in, you talk about 1.6 million people who've claimed asylum and been granted the right to remain in this country who are unemployed, who are not working.
Esther,
so we've had people coming into this country that are just not filling.
Well, asylum seekers aren't allowed to. Of course, we have employment problems and skills problems in all walks.
They're not filling the jobs.
I think it's interesting that we talk about migrants filling the gaps in our economy. No one's talking about actually let's invest in British people, British workers. Let's pay them more. Because here's the thing: the argument that many people, and I don't want to say on the left, but many people say about sort of migration and these genderless widgets that are not human beings, that apparently don't come with values and a culture that may or may not be compatible with Britain, is this idea that they're just going to do these jobs like they're a bunch of robots. But the argument is never actually, instead of importing in thousands of people to work in the care sector, for instance, for £20,000 a year, why don't we actually pay carers more?
Why can't we have both?
British workers? No, because the thing is, you can't have both if the argument is, we need more people to fill these gaps. How then do you simultaneously say, let's pay British people more? You can't have both. You have to.
As we got more people in, they become older.
Esther, the point that I would add to that is that I'd never approach migration from an economic perspective only. I think it's a huge social and cultural good, and I will defend that point.
OK. All right. Thank you.